each of those smallest units, the tiniest resolution we can see, contains 5.5 million neurons, between, or up to 5.5 times 10 to the 10, which is a trillion more, I don't know, 50 trillion synapses, 22 kilometers of dendrites, that's the input side of the neuron, and 220 kilometers of axons, that's the output side. And there's a little asterisk here, note, bottom of the page, yes, those figures are correct. And I put that in because when I was writing it, finishing it off, went back, this can't be true. This is just too mind-boggling. So I went back to the paper and checked it again, and it is true.
Okay, so Matthew Cobb is a professor in the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Manchester, where he studies olfaction, insect behavior, and the history of science. He earned his PhD in psychology and genetics from the University of Sheffield. He is the author of 5 books: Life's Greatest Secret, Generation, The Resistance, 11 Days in August, and Smell, a very short introduction. He lives in England. Today we're going to discuss his book, The Idea of the Brain. And it really matches our podcast name. Little Brains, Victor. We have someone written about the brain. So
at last.
Yes, finally. That's why we made our podcast.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. Good to be here. Perfect.
So first of all, what motivated you to write the book?
I can't really remember. It was a long time ago we started writing it. So my previous book, which was kind of about the history of genetics in the 1950s and the 1960s, I finished that in, I don't know, 2014. We finished writing it, came out in 2015. And so with my then editor, who since died, we discussed the next book. And I think it might have been him who said, well, why don't you write something about the brain? And so, yeah, basically that was it. Publisher trying to keep my nose to the grindstone. But as I said, it was a long time ago. The book took over 4.5 years to write. And maybe we'll talk a bit later on about the kind of strange process that you go through when you're writing a book.
Wow. 4.5 years. Yeah, but it's 500 pages, isn't it? It's a very... detailed.
Well, it was initially around about 140, 150,000 words. And my current editor, Ed Lake, at Profile Books, he said, no, that's far too long. You're gonna have to cut it by about 25,000 words. So we had a bit of an argument about that. But editors are normally right, and anybody who tells you it should be shorter is almost certainly correct.
Oh wow.
So I've learned this, that you just say, yeah, okay. And writers have a phrase about this. It's called kill your darlings. So everything that you've written, whether you're a student or a successful author, you have things that you love dearly, little factoids, little stories that you've squirreled out and you really, really love. And they're the ones that have got to go first because, to be honest, they're not really necessary. They get in the way of the kind of thread of the story. So I cut 25,000 words off. I surreptitiously put in another 5 over the subsequent months. But it ended up a lot better. It didn't actually, they were things that weren't necessary. I mean, and me looking at it with a butcher's gleam in my eye, how can I cut this? You realize that there are bits that are kind of baggy and aren't really necessary. And by tightening it up, the whole story becomes much clearer.
You should have like an extended edition of the book releasing.
No, it wasn't. It made virtually no difference, really. I mean, there are a lot of adjectives got cut out as well. So, tip for any students who are listening or watching, if you're trying to get it down to that word count, then go through it. Just, put it to one side, then go back and just really think, is this necessary? Is this sentence saying anything? Can I say it in half the space? Can I compress these 2 sentences? And you generally can. And whilst you'll lose some of your glorious prose, you know what? It probably wasn't glorious anyway. Mine certainly wasn't. And it gets better by being shorter and tighter. That's a general rule. Less is more.
Less is more. Okay. So, could you give us a brief overview of how our understanding of the brain evolved over time? Or did it? One thing I learned from reading your book was it didn't really evolve.
Right. Okay. So I guess the bottom line is we have no idea how the brain works, right?
Okay.
So that's kind of like the truth. And when I was writing the book, Ed, my editor, he said to me at one point, he said, well, okay, so what's the answer? How does the brain work? And I said, I haven't the foggiest idea. And he said, you can't say that. That's no good. We've got to sell it. You want a hook. It's got to have, you've got to say it works like it's a blancmange or, it's quantum mechanics or something. You've got to have an explanation. I said, well, the problem is there isn't one. And that's going to be the kind of story. And he wasn't convinced. And to be honest, I wasn't either. Because, saying to people, hey, here's a 500-page book. You're going to wade through it. And at the end, I'm going to go, I have no idea. I mean, it's not very convincing. It's not, kind of attractive. But as I was writing, so the initial starting point was to tell basically the history of how we've understood the brain, not its anatomy, because I don't know anything about anatomy, but what we think it does and how it works. And initially it was kind of like the worst kind of history. It was one damn thing after another. And that was the kind of initial plan that I'd sold the book on. And to my first editor, John Davium, and he'd agreed to this. And looking back, it was pretty dire. And then while I was writing, and then when I was getting to the final editing stage, I realized that, in fact, there was a theme that had been sitting there in the book and that I could bring out more. And that was how, at different times, people have thought about the brain in terms of contemporary technology. So the idea in general in science, and in particular in biology, we use metaphor, something is like something, to explain how things work. So the simplest thing is the heart. So in the 17th century, when they realized the basic action of the heart, they said, well, the heart's like a pump, which it is in a way. I mean, it's basically a pump. It's pumping your blood round your blood vessels. So they were using a metaphor of the pump, which is actually very, very accurate, to say that's what the heart does. But in fact, the heart isn't a pump, or rather it's like a pump that's not like any mechanical pump or any other kind of pump we've ever built, because you may have noticed it keeps on going. It doesn't stop. It's got this continuous activity that carries on until the day you die. And that is caused by all sorts of complicated things that nobody in the 17th century could ever have hoped to understand. So the metaphor is true, but it's also not true. It's partial. And that's generally the way that, in particular biology, but an awful lot of science works, by finding metaphors that can explain very complicated phenomena. And biology in particular works like that because, with all due modesty, and sorry physicists out there, but biology is the most complicated stuff in the universe, and the human brain is the most complicated object that there is, as far as we know. I mean, okay, there are alien brains out on Pluto or whatever, then yeah, okay, they're going to be complicated as well. But the brain is the most complicated thing there is. So I realized that I could kind of give a thread to the story and make it much less than one damn thing and after another, and explain something, which is really the whole point of it all, of course, by showing how at different times, different metaphors from technology have been used. So our ideas about the brain, the idea of the brain, has changed as our technology has changed. And you can see this most explicitly in the first person to really think about the brain in this way, and that's Descartes, the French philosopher in the 17th century, who's wandering around in the public gardens in Paris, and he sees these kind of animatronic statues. So they're powered by water, they're hydraulic statues. Bit like an animatronic thing you'd see in a theme park or a museum or some kind of show today. And these statues would work in a kind of jerky way. They would emerge from the undergrowth on rails, and this statue made up to look like Samson or somebody would raise his club and bop it down on the head of a kind of metal dragon. And all this working by water and pumps and everything. And Descartes, who was a very smart bloke, looked at it and he thought, maybe that's how our bodies work. Maybe all this water coursing about produces this artificial movement. And he knew they weren't alive. He wasn't a fool, you know, but he could use it as a metaphor. So, okay, maybe that's how the brain works. Maybe in our nerves, there is this kind of force, this power, a bit like water, going down, causing activity, getting sensory signals and bringing them back. Now that's wrong because, and people very soon proved it was wrong, because you just got to cut a nerve and nothing comes spurting out of it. There's no hydraulic power. It's not like an artery, yeah? And they could show this virtually instantly. But he was incredibly smart, because he looked at these statues and he thought, wait a minute. Now what's surprising is that although we think of kind of the 17th and 15th, 16th, 17th centuries being the time you get clockwork, you get these hydraulic power developing. These kind of statues that Descartes had seen, they were around in antiquity. So the ancient Greeks had them, the ancient Romans had them. And they would be, you know, they would, I don't know, they'd have birds that would sing and stuff like that, you know, really quite astonishing artifacts. But nobody, as far as we know, none of those smart philosophers sat and looked at them and thought, wait a minute, maybe that's how we work. So Descartes was wrong, but he was also right. And this is in general, this what you call the dialectic, this being wrong and right at the same time, is part of what powers science, because science is never all right. It's never completely true. There's always something left we don't understand. And that's the next bit. So our discoveries, our findings are always right and wrong. So basically what the book does is to show how different technologies, starting with water power, but then going on to electricity, and then various electrical devices, and then finally in the 20th century, obviously, with the computer, have actually shaped how we've seen the brain. So the book is divided into 3 unequal bits. There's the past, which has all the, you know, electrical devices up to the computer. And then rather perversely, I say the present, which is from 1950 onwards. And the reason why that's the present is that's the model that all modern neuroscientists think about, that the brain is something like a computer. It's got a computer metaphor. And that really shapes everything from 1950s onwards. So the present part of the book is not sequential, in that it deals with different themes, looking at each of them from the 1950s to the present day. And then the very, very brief future part of it, closing part, is my kind of ambitious predictions as for where we're going.
Okay, we'll definitely get to the ambitious predictions at the end. Really want to know what's going to happen. Yeah, I feel with brain, we're still at the stage of making up better, improving our metaphors, as opposed to understanding it. You know, yeah. With heart, eventually we gave, like, you know, if you're a doctor now, they don't teach you heart with metaphor. They know all the little mechanics.
Yeah, I think we've probably got the heart nailed.
We got the heart nailed, right? But with the brain, we're still talking about it in terms of computer. But there are, like, as I've heard you explain, very big differences between how computers operate and neurons. How computers are digital, neurons are analog. Could you explain that to us a bit?
Yeah. So what's interesting is that this link with the computer is partly because of the fact that, you know, computers can deal with information of various modalities. They process it, they do things with it, and they have an input and an output. And, well, a brain's a bit like that. So, you know, the brain is a bit like a computer in the sense that it's a device that does all those things. It's an organ that does all those things, and it's embedded in our body. And that is one thing that, you know, my computer here is not embedded in anything. It just is, right? But my brain is part of my body. And I know that because if I have a drink of alcohol, it's going to affect how the processor works. If I have a drink of coffee, it's going to affect how the processor works. If I'm feeling frightened, then that emotion isn't even going to be felt. It's not going to be felt. It doesn't feel like it's in here. It feels like it's down here. Well, for me anyway, you know, I get churning guts if I'm nervous and frightened. So clearly there's something very, very different from a computer and a brain. But the really interesting thing is this metaphor about which is which. So in 1943, a couple of neuroscientists called McCulloch and Pitts produced a paper which explained how nervous systems might perform calculations. And by using very simple logic and what they thought the nervous system was organized by, they showed that, for example, if you've got a neuron that's connected to two other neurons, say from a sensory input coming in, this neuron, you might have it so that it could fire only if it receives signals from both those signals. So it wants signal A and signal B. You might have another neuron in the same kind of anatomical position that would only fire if either A or B were firing.
Oh, it's kind of like the logic gates in computers.
Right. Okay. So they were just,
right.
Those things did not exist at the time. This is logic.
Oh, fair enough.
Okay. So this is the interesting point. This is just pure logic, these two. One of them's Walter Pitts was, I think, 17 at the time. He was a brilliant mathematician. He left school at 15. I mean, amazing, weird bloke. Like, you know, people at the time who never met him thought people had made him up. He was so bizarre and clever and all the rest of it. So he's just thinking about logic. And you've got and, or, if. You've got all these different gates that you can make in logic. And this was something that had been developed in the 1930s. Alan Turing was interested in it. But it was all about logic. And they said, look, nervous systems seem to be built this way. And in fact, there's what's called an immanent logic. The very way that a nervous system is wired up produces this kind of logical behavior. Now, unfortunately, it's not true. In that no nervous system works like that, not even the simplest one. But it was an interesting idea. And somebody read it, and that somebody was a man called John von Neumann. John von Neumann was a very, very smart mathematician. He is the man who designed what we are using now. All modern computers are digitally based and have a von Neumann architecture. And what von Neumann says in 1945 to the American government when he's planning, in between planning the nuclear attacks on Japan, which is coming up to the anniversary of that, he was involved in that, and he chose the Nagasaki site and attack. So
wow.
A man who, let's say, has a mixed legacy.
Father of modern computers also nuked.
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
Yeah.
But what he does is say to the American government, right, we're going to build this computer, and it's going to be a digital computer, and we know how to wire it up because that's how nervous systems are wired up. Look, there's this paper from McCulloch and Pitts 2 years ago. It's amazing. So we're going to build a computer that's like a brain. So initially, the computer was literally like a brain, or like how some people thought a brain worked. Very quickly, it became apparent the brains didn't work like that, which if they talked to anybody who actually records some neurons or really knew anything about neuroanatomy, they could have told them. But anyway, then the computer becomes this amazing digital object, and we start to think, wow, it can do all this processing. That's what brains do. So therefore, the brain is like a computer. And the metaphor of the computer being like a brain only lasts kind of a couple of years before people realize, well, it's just not. But the opposite has come to dominate our way of thinking and has proved enormously productive as a way of thinking about what the brain does. I've described it. It does this processing. Part of the issue, you mentioned the digital business. So students sometimes get confused about this because, so neurons fire. They send what's called a spike, an action potential. And it goes down the neuron from the dendrite to the axon. There's a message. And that is digital. That either happens or it doesn't. And it's always the same size, and it goes down, and it either happens or it doesn't. So some people think, oh, well, yeah, that's digital, man. So it's the same thing as a computer. Except when you actually record from a neuron, and anybody who does this knows this, that the main way they do indeed fire or not fire, but the message is actually analog. So if this was shown, I have a great deal about this in the book, in the 1920s, that when they made the first recordings from single neurons, these were stretch receptors from a frog's leg. And they showed that as you increase the weight put more and more kind of milligrams on it, it fired more and more. So it's always showing a spike, but the number of spikes per second increases linearly with weight. In other words, it's an analog signal. So the real, same way that your ears are working now, hearing me, that's not digital. There's an intensity, a number of spikes per second. In fact, some of the work that I've done on the maggot nose shows that, in fact, the signal has also got a temporal component. So it's the shape of that waveform that goes, all these hundreds of spikes that go down the neuron. So, in fact, neurons are incredibly complicated. They can go up, they can go down, they can show no change. So that's not a 0 or a 1. It's something else. It's in multiple dimensions. It's analog. So brains don't work like computers, but they do some of the things that computers do. Yeah, they get information, they process it, they organize inputs, outputs. But if you remember what I said about being in a brain, being in a body rather, the brain is in a body. There was a neuroscience paper which had this title, which you might think, well, it's a bit obvious, isn't it? The brain has a body. But it's really, really important that our brains aren't just, bobbing around in a vat. They are completely interconnected with our sensory experience. And that's how we learn. That's how our bodies, our brains, our personalities, that mysterious mind thing come to be through their interaction with the body. So, we're animals. We're not devices that have been built. We're animals that have adapted over hundreds of millions of years and have got all sorts of weird odds and ends floating about in them that mean that we do things sometimes in a strange way. So there are parallels between a computer and a brain. They're very useful. But kind of the argument as the book goes on, and this isn't something that I've made up. I mean, like I said, I work on maggot neurons, right? That's my speciality. I work on the maggot's nose. I don't actually work on brains at all. So I had to do a lot of reading. And you soon discover that there are an awful lot of neuroscientists out there going, you know what? We've no idea. We've got all these data that we're collecting more and more from these astonishing connectomes, which is how brains are wired up. We can manipulate in small brains, in brains like a maggot brain, fly brain, worm brain, such as it is. We can manipulate, turn neurons on and off, remove them, and all the rest of it. And yet we've got no idea what's going on. But the key for this is, in fact, not a brain at all. It's the lobster's stomach. So the lobster, right, has got a stomach which it puts its food in and then it grinds it up. A bit like a bird has, dinosaurs grind up grain by swallowing stones. Well, the lobster doesn't swallow up stones. It's got this really muscular stomach that can do this motion. It's got a series of rhythms in the muscles, and they're produced by 30 neurons. And these 30 neurons can switch between two kind of cyclical patterns. And you think, that's pretty straightforward. We know how those neurons are connected. We know exactly what they do. Surely we could put all that data into a computer and model how those 30 neurons produce these two alternate rhythms. Well, you'd think, wouldn't you? I mean, it makes sense. It's not complicated. It's not a brain. And yet, this has been the life's work of a brilliant neuroscientist called Eve Marder, who works in Boston in America. And she and her very, very talented postdoctoral researchers have been studying this for decades. And they cannot explain how these 30 neurons produce these rhythms. They can't say, okay, here in our model, our computer model, let's see what happens if we take out this neuron, and let's see what physically happens in the lobster's stomach if we take it out. Two things don't make any sense. They can't predict. They know that these rhythms emerge from these 30 neurons, but they also know from doing the modeling that many other ways of organization could produce those activities, but they don't. It's just these 30 neurons. And they can't predict why and how explain really how and why these 30 neurons do what they do. So that's the challenge. Whenever you see something about, we've explained this and we've got a neural network that's going to do that, we don't understand the lobster's stomach. And that's the gap there is between understanding even a fly brain, right? Even a fly brain, understanding that, and we can't understand the lobster's stomach. Fly brain's got about 100,000 neurons.
100,000.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So that tells you how complicated it is.
I mean, yeah, go for it, Nathan.
Sort of going back a bit to, you were talking about sort of the brain situated in the body and the sort of integrated system. What's the kind of division of labour, I guess, between the body and the brain? Like, what does, I guess there's a sort of central nervous system, and how does the brain and the body sort of work together?
Well, a lot of what the body does, it does on its own. Okay, so you can see this, you can sever many of the links between the brain and the body, and people, they've got enormous problems. They may be tetraplegic, so they've got no control of their arms and legs anymore. But the rest of everything from they can't feel anything, they can't control anything, but the rest of their body carries on doing their stuff. So they breathe, thankfully. Their heart carries on beating. They defecate. If they're a man, they can ejaculate. So they don't feel anything. So that means that some people who are in wheelchairs men who are in wheelchairs can have children. There's no pleasure associated with it, because it's all a spinal reflex. Yeah. So clearly you don't need that connection, but I'm not going to get all hippy dippy with you, but what you put into your body, what you eat, is going to affect in various complicated ways how you're feeling. One of the ways that we're getting increasingly interested in is what's called the microbiome. So these are all the microbes you've got living in your guts. And it's now becoming increasingly clear that they're not simply there to help digestion. One of the things that they do is to produce precursors of neurotransmitters. Now, the exact role of neurotransmitters in mood, in how we feel, is much more complicated than is generally presented, and we don't really understand it. But the fact that, clearly there are some hormones, for example, as I mentioned, feeling frightened, adrenaline, right? So if you're frightened or excited, that affects your mood, yeah? But it's also in your body. You can feel it going around your body. It's very, we've all been there. And it's a good thing and it's a bad thing, depending on whether what's happening is an exciting thing or a terrifying thing. But those emotions, and there's not much about emotion in the book, partly because it's very, very hard to pin down, because getting to grips with it in animal models, which is the main way, of course, we're allowed to do experiments. It's very difficult, quite rightly so, to do experiments on human beings. It's very hard to ask the animal, well, what do you feel? You get kind of, a rat's afraid by counting its turds, to be brutal. That's how you measure it. You put it in a place that it doesn't like, and then you count the number of fecal pellets you get at the end, and that gives you a measure. But you can't actually ask the rat, what's it like? Because we're getting a bit philosophical there. What would it say? You don't know. It would squeak it. But you've got there is this link between the brain and the body, which is multiple at many different levels. And I think that the emotion thing is the main one, so the book starts with quite a surprising chapter. The book starts with the heart, right? And you might think, why is a book on the brain starting with stuff about the heart? And the answer is that for most of human history, as far as we can tell, most people around the world have thought that feelings are not in the head at all. That's a very, very recent idea. Most people, for most of the time, have thought that it was either in your heart, in your kidneys, or even, in the case of Aboriginal Australian people, it wasn't in your body at all, that you weren't completely separate from the land. Your connection with the land was really what was significant. And asking an Aboriginal person, where do you think your mind is? Where in your body? They'd go, what? It doesn't make any sense. Okay. And it's quite possible that is really what we thought for most of the time, and that even the heart business is quite recent, because actually knowing what what people thought in the past is very difficult unless they wrote it down. So we're limited to, apart from the Aboriginal peoples where we can go and talk to them, and studies of other contacts with indigenous people from the 19th century when anthropologists went and talked to them, for example, in the Americas, and all down the Americas, from South America and North America, everybody pretty much thought that basically your emotions were in the heart and not in the brain. And there was a big argument about this in ancient Greece. It's kind of first time that people started to say, wait a minute, it's up here. And they said that partly because they looked at the anatomy, and you can see all the sensory organs, you can see them connected by these things that they called neurons, which meant thread. And you can see these threads going from the eyes into the brain. You can see from the ears going into the brain. You can see that in an animal. You don't need to look at a human. And so people started to say, well, wait a minute, it's in the brain, you know, this heart business, what's that got? There's no connection. And the answer to that was, yeah, but wait a minute, what do you feel like when you're frightened? You don't feel anything up here. It's all down here in your heart. And you go, yeah, don't give me that. It's the heart. And of course, there's no way of separating this out just by thinking about it. But we can see who won the argument. We can see it in the language. If you're down at heart, you're heartbroken, right? You got your heart in your mouth, you wear your heart in your sleeve. And it's the same in every language. I gave a talk in Bulgarian. Well, not in Bulgarian, but to a Bulgarian audience the other day. And I have a slide in which I show lots and lots of English phrases in which we use the heart term, you know, and they're just colloquial phrases. And you stick brain in, it just sounds weird, you know. He was down at brain. Okay, he was brain broken at losing his girlfriend. Well, you know, it doesn't work. So that's telling us that it's true, because of course it is in a way. That's the kind of fossil. It's an intellectual fossil sitting there in our language. So when I did the Bulgarian talk, I said, okay, rather than have my slide with English words, can you give me the Bulgarian phrases? Because I knew they'd exist. And they said, yeah, they gave me a whole load of equivalent Bulgarian phrases, which I did check in Google Translate in case they were making me say bum or something. So you can see that actually working out where on earth the action is really very hard. And you can see that in Shakespeare even. So in Twelfth Night, there's one of those songs that you skip over when you're at school because it's just too boring. And one of the players who comes on and plucks his lute and says something, he says, tell me where is fancy bred, or in the heart or in the head. So he was saying, where ideas come from? Are they in the heart or in the head? So Shakespeare in 1601 or something like that, he knew that there was this argument going on which had rumbled on from the ancient Greeks through the Arab world right into modernity and the beginning of science, that people still didn't know where it was. So even Shakespeare knew this, and presumably the groundlings in the Globe Theatre would have slapped their thighs and say, that's a good one, Will, tell us another. They don't know these people, they've no idea. And what's interesting is that you'd expect that there'd be a moment, right, that the apple would fall on the head, which of course didn't happen either. There'd be a moment at which something happened, at which there was an experiment. This proves it. But there wasn't. There was never any brain-centric moment. There wasn't an experiment. There wasn't a thought. There wasn't a bit of anatomy that proved it. It was just a slow accumulation from kind of the 15th century up until the 18th century, very gradually in Europe, amongst the intellectuals who were doing this stuff, that very gradually they became confident that it was the brain. But clearly, most people carried on thinking it was the heart, and that's why we've still got all those words in our language, because it doesn't feel that way. So this is part of the problem in studying the brain, is you got to, introspection, thinking about things isn't enough. You can't do it. And the ancient Greeks found that. That's why they couldn't settle this argument, because nobody had any proof.
Is it possible that there is sort of a feedback loop between your body and your brain? So sort of, well, basically I do a lot of meditation. So
Absolutely.
Because so for example, if you have pleasant thoughts, your state of body, your breathing changes. If you have unpleasant thoughts, your body tenses up. And that in turn can lead you to have bad thoughts.
Yeah.
so I don't know how it would translate into in the
Well, I'm not sure anybody does, to be honest, right?
Fair enough.
But as an empirical statement, yes, it works. Yeah, clearly, meditation, ways of relaxing, that's all the stuff we're hearing about now. What are they telling us? They're saying, you know, being locked down is crap. You're all going slightly bonkers. We all are. Get some exercise. Do some meditation. So in other words, exactly what you say, the way you are altering the mind can alter the body and the body will alter. If you go out for a run, or you can't run, do some physical exercise of any kind, do it regularly, even a tiny little bit, you're going to end up feeling much better. And quite how that works is a bit magic, and people say, oh, well, it's to do with your neurotransmitters, and you're gonna get the chemical balance back, right? And there's a whole industry of drugs that are sold for depression and anxiety on the basis of this chemical imbalance, that you need to get your serotonin back in balance, or your dopamine, or whatever it is. And what's interesting is that whole idea of a chemical imbalance, if you know anything about the history of medicine, you know that for about 2,000 years, people in the West believed in something called the humours, the theory of the four humours, which were these things in your body that you had to have in balance. And if you didn't have them in balance, if you had too much black bile, yellow bile, I've forgotten the other two, then you weren't happy, or you might be depressed. And you had to get them back into balance and then they'd say, well, various foods or whatever. So the chemical imbalance theory is in fact a kind of modern version of Galen's ideas. This Galen was the guy who came up with this. He was also one of the first proponents of the idea of the brain being the center of thought. And what's striking is that the reason why that has some purchase, why when the chemical imbalance theory was kind of suggested, okay, you're going to take these, so many viewers, listeners may be taking SSRIs for depression. So these are serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And the idea is that serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter, will be left in the gap between two neurons, which is called a synapse. And normally the message goes across two neurons, and then it's taken up again and reprocessed, and then get ready for the next one. And the idea of SSRIs, they're going to leave the serotonin in there. So you're going to boost your serotonin levels, and you're going to feel less depressed. Now, these SSRIs, there's no evidence anywhere that anybody who is depressed actually has less serotonin in particular parts of their brain. There's no evidence that, well, the SSRIs work, they will increase your serotonin levels. But what's interesting is that they do that virtually instantly. But as anybody who's taken SSRIs knows, it takes weeks, if at all, for them to work. So you've got this problem whereby we've got this drug industry saying to people, take this, and many people take it, and some people feel much better on it, which is great, right? So don't get me wrong. And anybody watching, do not change your drugs without talking to your physician. I'm not a physician. I don't know anything about you. I only know about maggots. So don't listen to me, or listen to me, but don't take any advice, because I'm not giving you any, right? Because you need to talk to your physician. So for some people, these drugs work. Fantastic. For other people, as everybody knows, they don't work, or they come off them and they have terrible crashes and all the rest of it. So we've got this there's been a huge row, major row between various medics and physicians and neuroscientists and big pharmaceutical companies and patients as to whether these things actually work. But part of the issue is, if you think about being depressed and what people say about being depressed, it feels exactly like that. I'm low. I can't, it feels like there's this grey cloud over me. Churchill famously called it the black dog. He got the black dog was in him. And he couldn't, when he was depressed, he just couldn't function. And everybody knows that's what it feels like. And that's why the theory of the humours worked, because that's what it feels like, And that's why people embraced the idea of the chemical imbalance, because that's what it felt like. And you can think about the same kind of thing with people who are addicted to drugs, who've got impulsive behavior. You're driven to do it. It's like there's something inside you making you do it. In my case, it's buying books. I've got to buy that book. you know, but in other people, it may be an addiction to a drug or a destructive behavior, gambling, whatever. And so we've got this model of how the brain works, which is, so we talked about a computer. How does that, this kind of stuff coursing in us, going through our veins, making us feel things, which is what we feel like, and we all accept, how does that fit with it being a computer where you've got 0, 1, digital, bing, bong, flip, flop, plop? Doesn't make any sense. But these are two models that we all have in our brains and our idea about how we work, and we have them simultaneously. I think the saddest part of the book I wrote was the bit on the chemical understanding of the brain and where we are with mental health. Because on the one hand, so if you read any books, novels, stuff like that from the 1950s and before that, they're all about Freud. They're all about these ideas about how the brain works and how the mind works. And Freudian psychiatry was a really big thing. And then you think about how we all behave now, and nobody knows anything about Freud. And everybody thinks that it's all about neurotransmitters. So what happened? Well, what happened was that we discovered that some drugs could work. We discovered neurotransmitters in the brain, which weren't known. We discovered that there were drugs that can have an absolutely transforming effect on people's lives. Even simple drugs like lithium salt can turn people from being psychotic into being absolutely able to function completely normally. So astonishing breakthroughs were made. People got very, very excited. An awful lot of money was made. And we all adopted this model of chemical imbalance, take a pill, you'll feel better. And who doesn't want to do that? I mean, sounds great. The tragedy is that all of the big pharmaceutical companies, every one of them has shut down their research on mental health. So we've got a paradoxical situation. We've got a situation which we recognize mental health issues and people are prepared to speak about it, which is fantastic. And there's much less stigma associated with it. And we're aware, as I mentioned earlier, of this link with the body and exercise. And so some minor problems may be dealt with, or you can certainly feel better by going out and taking a walk. And, you know, that's now a big thing about how we're coping with the virus. And on the other hand, you've got the big pharmas going, no idea, mate. We're not going to make, plus we're not going to make a penny on it. We're shutting it all down. The pipeline is literally empty. Part of the problem is it takes decades to bring drugs online, from making the first insight to actually somebody taking a pill and feeling better. And because of our understanding of the brain is so poor, it's very hard to see how you can, you know, find a way into that. And the main things that are happening are things like ketamine. So ketamine, which was a big party drug, you go in the K-hole, you know, and this was used as initially used as an anesthetic for animals. And then people in the 90s started having fun with it. And everybody, oh my God, it's terrible. It's going to kill everybody. It's an awful drug. You don't remember, you're too young. But the press was absolutely all over it. Just like the press used to be all over ecstasy. Press used to be all over LSD. And all these drugs are in fact given because people are taking them because they make them feel happy. You know, there's a reason why these are party drugs. And they are having an effect on the brain. And there may be ways that we can use them. So all these drugs are now being kind of got out of the drawer or out of the rave and into the little pills you can take. And ketamine has now been approved for use with depression. And we know it's okay, basically, because people have had a lot of fun for it for the last couple of decades. And the same thing with ecstasy and NDA. People are very interested in using that, and even microdosing LSD. Not taking, you know, big tabs of it and then having terrible trips because you think you've turned into a lobster or whatever and nobody can understand your stomach. But because these are the kinds of things that were discovered in the 1950s, drugs like LSD, which was in fact discovered in 1943, they give insight into how the brain works. The problem is marshalling that and using it as a way of treatment. That is very, very hard. And so for mental health, we're ended up, because we've junked the old Freudian schemas, which didn't work, and basically it's just meant that rich people spend a lot of time giving money to psychiatrists to get richer by sitting and talking to them about their mothers or whatever, and it never ended. That was part of the deal. We've had some pills that work for some people, but for a lot of people don't. And we've got this recognition of a major problem in the community, the global community, and no real way of dealing with it beyond talking therapy, which can be fantastic, but is incredibly intensive. And so, for example, the NHS can't, if any viewers have been tried to access mental health services, it's really, really hard. And the reason for that is that it takes a long time to train people. And even then, it's not necessarily going to work. So we've got this enormous paradox, yeah? And that writing that chapter was pretty depressing. And in a way, I say at the end of it, my kind of not criticisms, my remarks are perhaps ultimately don't count, because you know what? If you could find a reliable treatment for depression and we had no idea how it worked, we wouldn't care. We'd take it, whatever it was, because the need is so great. So it doesn't really matter if we don't fully understand it. We're not going to wait until we understand the whole of the human brain before we can find appropriate treatments. But for some people, pills work. If you're taking your pills and you feel better, carry on taking them. Talk to your physician if you want, but do not stop taking them without consulting your physician.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm aware of the different psychological models for sort of what's going on in the brain after when people are experiencing anxiety or depression or after traumatic events. But is there any sort of actual, I guess, chemical or electrical difference, very sort of empirical difference that can be observed between a person who isn't experiencing serious mental health issues brain and somebody who is? Is there anything that no we can point?
No.
Oh, that was actually my question as well. That was my question. So
there's no way of, virtually nothing about the brain can you tell by looking from the outside. A few things. So one of the debates that goes on throughout history and is still going on now, and there's another thread going through it, is, are things, ideas, concepts, are they somewhere? Are they in a place in the brain? Is there localization of function? Is there a bit of the brain that does this? Yeah. Because if there is a bit of the brain that does whatever, makes you feel happy, then maybe we can see it lighting up inside a scanner, and the more it lights up, the happier you are. So if you're depressed, it's not lighting up very much. That's the kind of idea that you would imagine is true. And what's striking is that there's been this long-running argument about whether anything is localized. Now, you're going to say, wait a minute, something's got to be localized somewhere in the brain, because there's the brain. Unless you're telling me that it's all interconnected, man, and it's all just stuff, and, it only works by all being together. Well, I am saying that a bit, but there are some bits that are localized that do things. But as soon as we get to that idea that there are localizations, we start to discover that there are interconnections with different areas of the brain. So, for example, one of the best known bits of localization is something called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is two structures in the brain, deep at the bottom, which allegedly look a bit like a seahorse, which is why they're called hippocampus. And we now know that these are kind of the gateway for memory. That memories, they're not in the hippocampus, but if you don't have a hippocampus, you've got trouble. And we know this from a poor man called Henry Molaison, who's very famous for neuroscientists. And poor Henry, in 1953, he had an operation because he had terrible epilepsy. And so a surgeon who wasn't actually skilled in doing operations on epilepsy said, okay, yeah, I'll fix you. And basically he got two drills and he bored holes just above Henry's eyes, holes about, 1.5, 2 centimeters wide into his brain. Now, he didn't know what he was doing. He couldn't. The result was Henry seemed fine and his epilepsy slightly declined. But then they noticed, wait a minute, he doesn't remember anything from since the operation. He can only remember the stuff that he can keep in his head. So if I give you a telephone number, if you Okay, these days when you get somebody's telephone number, you just touch phones or something bizarre like that. But in the old days, you had to give somebody a telephone number. And basically, you can keep going 7 numbers in your head, easy. 9 at a most. But if you've got an 11 number, you get lost, unless you can kind of put it in chunks. So there's this magic number 7 plus or minus 2, which is basically what our continuous memory. The memory, a bit like you have in a computer before you turn it off, right? So not the recording memory. The RAM, yeah. It's not really RAM in the brain or anything, yeah. But anyway, your RAM, which is floating around, is about between 5 and 9 chunks long. So Henry could remember stuff like that, but he couldn't remember yesterday. He carried on living until the 2000s. So for another 50 years, this poor man who had no idea about anything that had happened since the autumn of 1953, he was studied by psychologists, and they got to know him. And every time he said, oh yeah, I'd love to help you with the experiment. Yes, right. Okay, what do you want me to do? Yes, okay, I'll try and do that. Next day, oh yes, of course, I'd love to do this for you. So he was told what had happened, and he could remember it for that day, but he didn't know the next day. So it's a bit like there's that film where the geezer's got a write all over him. I forgot what it's called. Memento, is that what it's called? You young people know. There's some film like that. Somebody's got to write down because they
I've
can't.
Seen it.
Yeah. Okay, I haven't done it.
Yeah.
I'm too old. So we know partly from this stuff on Henry Mollison and also from a lot of studies on rats in the 1970s, 1980s, that the hippocampus helps to put memories somewhere. But where? So we know that if you record from people's brains, you can actually evoke memories. It's most bizarre. So I have this, I mean, I first read about this stuff from the 1950s. Again, these patients were having treatment. They're going to have surgery to help cure their epilepsy. Now we can do that with pills, so these operations don't happen very often. And by recording from different parts of the brain, stimulating, put a tiny little electric pulse in there, people would say, oh, wait a minute, I just saw my little brother being told off by his mum because he put his shirt on the wrong way around. Or I can hear that song, and they start singing a popular song. So, and these weren't important things, they were just crap, were somehow in their heads, and by putting an electrode in, a tiny little bit of electricity, bang, people are re-experiencing this weird dream-like state. So it wasn't like they were in the room, it was like a dream. So it was strange and a bit unsettling to these people because it was so precise. And you put the electrode back in the same place and you get the same stuff back. Very, very odd.
And how did they decide where to put the electrode?
Well, they were just kind of poking around.
Oh, so wait, that's crazy. That's
yeah,
crazy.
They didn't know what they were going to get. They certainly didn't know they were that. There's a big surprise to them. So I read this and I thought, can this be true? And it is. It's absolutely true. And people replicated and people are still studying it. So we got bits of our brain that are amazingly precise. But the same bit in somebody else's brain wouldn't be, oh, that's me seeing my little brother, me seeing my mum. It would be something else completely. So you get very, very localized function, but that's not a single cell. It's a whole series of cells. So more recently, so when I was an undergraduate, people try to work out how vision works, okay? And one of the exciting things is that in the 1950s, 2 people called Hubel and Wiesel discovered that in the cat brain, in the visual cortex, so the bit where the eyes go to straight away, the initial processing of the visual cortex, there are cells that, a bit like those cells we talked about earlier on, the and the or gates, that they seem to connect different bits of signal from the visual field, and that you'd get cells that would detect lines, little dots, and that cells on the next level up would detect all those dots together, and so they could detect a line. So you had bits in the brain that seemed to be detecting lines, and you'd put a line in front of a cat and a certain cell would get very excited. And these were organized in columns in the brain. So the top cell would detect a vertical line, the next one down would detect a slight angle going down as you went down through the brain. So there was some kind of organization in the brain. This is localization of function. You got identifying lines in particular places. Great. Okay. Okay, so how do we put lines together to see all this stuff? How do we make a visual image? Well, maybe we just stick those lines together. Okay, so I've got a line, and I can imagine having one cell here detects a horizontal line in this part of the visual surface field. Another one detects a vertical line, another vertical line, a horizontal line. Or I can detect a square. You could build a model, say, okay, we got things that can measure squares. And so then the joke was, and this was actually a joke that somebody made, said, it's a very complicated joke where I won't go into, but the punchline is, well, what about your grandmother? That means you must have a cell somewhere for seeing your grandmother. If we got this kind of hierarchical stuff, you know, we got bazillions of cells, so why not? I've got a cell for my grandmother. But wait a minute, I can still recognize my grandmother when she's standing on her head, when she's sitting in a chair, when she's playing a ukulele, when she's riding a horse backwards. It's still my grandmother. So you telling me I've got cells for every one of these things? That's just bonkers, man. I can't, there aren't enough atoms in the universe for us to be able to recognize everything. So this was a joke that we told, and ha, 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 anybody who thinks this is complete nonsense. But remember that stuff. We've got bits of the brain that are remembering and coding kind of in bizarre episodes. And then in 2009, some more experiments on people who were having operations for their epilepsy. And again, these people very kindly said to the neuroscientist, yeah, sure, poke away in my brain, I don't mind. And so this time they're recording. So they're putting electrodes into different parts of the face recognition. So bits of the brain that seem to be associated with face recognition. And they are recording from these areas, and they show a picture of Jennifer Aniston to one woman. And this cell, single cell, goes absolutely crazy. Jennifer Aniston. Brrr. Picture of Jennifer Aniston and Brad Pitt, who she was then married to. Nada, nothing, yet. Picture of Jennifer Aniston again. Brrr. So there's a cell that they're recording from one cell. There's a cell that responds to Jennifer Aniston, but not to Brad Pitt. And it will respond to all sorts of pictures of Jennifer Aniston. So does that mean, oh no, it wasn't all rubbish. Somebody else really liked, they found a cell that they showed them a picture of the Sydney Opera House. And the cell went really excited. And if they wrote the words Sydney Opera House, the cell equally got excited. So maybe it's a concept that's represented there. Somebody else, an engineer, they showed them in a quadratic equation and some cell went bizarre. So this is just really, really odd. Now, you might think, okay, this does mean I've got single cells that are, you know, all connected up in this hierarchical connection, and they're responding just if I see Jennifer Aniston. That's not true. What we're seeing is kind of, you've got to remember that you're recording from a single cell, but that cell is connected to millions of others. We've got about 80 billion neurons, plus I don't know how many other cells that are affecting those neurons in our brains. So there are loads and loads, and they're kind of overlapping. So you record from just one, and you may be getting a very excited response about Jennifer Aniston, but there's also lots of other cells that are slightly responding to Jennifer Aniston. This isn't the cell that does everything. It just so happens that's what they recorded from. I mean, cells are really, really, really tiny. I mean, you can't imagine how tiny they are. They're not as small as atoms, but they're very, very small. So basically, they're just putting a tiny electrode in, just hoping that they're going to find something. So you've got this mixture of localization of function and distribution of function, which again is completely different from a computer. Computer, you got a chip here, it does this. You got another one here, it does that. Brains are all mixed up. So even the visual field, the visual cortex, the back of the brain, that thing that they were recording from the 1950s, they noticed that these cells in the cat's brain, yes, they respond to sound, to vision, but they also respond to sound. They've got inputs coming in from the ears. You just think about it. What is a cat interested in? It's interested in movement, but it's interested in sound as well. Put the two together, you got a rustle, slight movement of leaves, bang, it's going to jump on the poor hapless mouse. So right from the very earliest stages of processing, we tend to think the brain's got different sensory areas. In Europe, the visual cortex, the olfactory cortex, the auditory cortex, but all of these areas are receiving input from other parts. So even the area I work in, the olfactory area, which is deep in the brain, about eye level, about here, it's kind of the first area that it's very, very primitive in many respects. That receives inputs from the visual cortex, from other parts of the brain, which modulate how our initial detection of odors is taking place. So there is localization of function, but it's very weird. It's localization, Jim, but not as we know it. There isn't a single cell doing a single thing, and it's not like a computer with distinct units only doing one job. It's much more complicated than that. That was a very long answer. Sorry.
Well,
yeah, that's the only response to that. Can you say something we do understand?
yeah. And I've heard that, for example, people who lose sight, then the area of brain that is related to sight, after a while, it starts processing sound. Is that
I don't know that.
really?
It might be true. I wonder. I
Right.
suspect not. My guess is no.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, part of the, I mean, I don't know. You need to have, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. So part of the issue is that the ways we normally have of testing this are those fMRI scans, right?
Yeah.
You've seen that with the bits of the brain lighting up, yeah? And there are hundreds of thousands of papers on fMRI published. And there's a huge, every year, I mean, enormous literature. People shove people in the scanner. They say, think about your grandmother. Oh, that bit up there is lighting up. Okay, right. That's your grandmother bit. They don't do that. That's the kind of thing they do. They say, imagine you're playing tennis or something like that. And clearly, from a clinical point of view, there are people in deep comas who you would want to know, are they in there? Because you do get these people with this locked-in syndrome. There's that film, the butterfly and the diving bell. Is that what it's called? Based on that, the French writer who had locked-in syndrome, and so he was in there completely compos mentis, but couldn't move anything. And people in comas who aren't responsive at all, you wonder, are they in there? So if we could put them in a scanner and say, hello, are you in there? Think, and they responded, it'd be a fantastic clinical tool. Part of the problem is there's this big gap between the people who work in fMRI and all other neuroscientists. And I have some rather choice quotes from people, neuroscientists who don't work in the field, saying basically they don't believe any of it. And the reason for this is that you've got to remember, all right, I'm going to give you some figures, and I'm going to drop my iPad on the floor. I'm going to give you some figures in here about what the fMRI actually detects. So, wait a minute. You can cut this out later on.
Yeah.
Where's it gone? It's not going out live, is it? Here we are. Right. Okay. So one of those images, one of those fMRI scans, it's made of pixels. Yeah, and we all now know what pixels are. They're the smallest units of each of those little squares. And of course, it's a 3D image. So in fact, these are 3D voxels, they're called, because you've got all three dimensions. And that's the smallest unit of what you can see on an fMRI scan. And each of those units, this is an estimate from 2008, but basically it hasn't changed much. Each of those smallest units, the tiniest resolution we can see, contains 5.5 million neurons up to 5.5 times 10 to the 10, which is a trillion more, 50 trillion synapses, 22 kilometers of dendrites, that's the input side of the neuron, and 220 kilometers of axons, that's the output side. And there's a little asterisk here, note, bottom of the page, yes, those figures are correct. And I put that in because when I was writing it, finishing it off, went back and said, this can't be true. This is just too mind-boggling. So I went back to the paper and checked it again, and it is true. So the tiniest unit of an fMRI scan is of an order of magnitude bigger than even 2 orders of our magnitude, even a bit more than a fly's brain. We have no idea how a fly brain, 100,000 neurons. We do not understand it. fMRI, 55.5 million neurons. And that's just the small bit. So those blobs you see are actually loads and loads of areas. Furthermore, what fMRI tells you is that something is happening. It just tells you there's blood in that area. That's literally what it is. Is there blood going into that area? So that area might be getting excited. It might be getting unexcited. It might be, we don't know. Furthermore, there've been a whole series of studies. I mean, now the fMRI community is getting very good at self-criticism. So there have been 3 major crises in the last 15 years about this, less than that, 12 years. First, and they've all come from within the community, which is very healthy. So I've got a lot of time for these people. I'm not dissing their research at all. It's just that for somebody who studies single neurons, if somebody tells to me, well, the lowest resolution I can get to is 5.5 million, I'm not very impressed. Okay. That's the problem. I'm dealing with very, very precise things. This is many of the criticisms of it come. But from within their community, they've criticized it. So first, in 2008, there's a very famous study of a dead salmon. So these fMRI researchers get a salmon, dead salmon, they stick it in an fMRI scanner, and they take images of its brain, and they show the dead salmon some photos. And they say, what do you think of this person? Is this person happy? And they show another person. What do you think of this landscape? Is it nice? And the salmon is responding, or not, because it's dead and it's a salmon and it's in a scanner and they like live in water. And they're getting signal because there's just random crap in the detector. And they use deliberately, this is a critique. They're being facetious. They're making a point. It's satire. They say, okay, we got an image in this part, we got a significant response in this part of the brain. Therefore, this part of the brain is the salmon thinking about the photos. Now, this is complete nonsense, and they did it as a joke. It did win the Ig Nobel Prize in 2011, I think. So it was eventually published in the Journal of Non-Reproducible Results, as it should be. And this was taken as a critique to say, look, we've got to be very careful about the measures we're doing, because, you know, if you think about it, you've got a background signal of just noise in the detector, and we've got to be very careful about how we subtract what we're interested in, somebody thinking about grandmother or playing tennis or something, from this background signal. Everybody goes, okay, we're going to do that. We're going to do that. Then about 5 years later, somebody goes, wait a minute. The methods you've been using are all wrong. You've had the knobs on your dials turned wrong. Literally, that was it. What was it? And they initially said 80,000 papers are going to have to be discredited because you've done all the sums wrong, because you haven't been calibrating your machine properly. Now, that figure came down a bit, but it's still very poor. There's still a lot of papers have had to be retracted. Most recently, they got the same data from about 100 people. So they get 100 people sitting in a scanner thinking of their grandmother or playing tennis, whatever it is, doesn't matter. And they gave it to set those data to 70 different groups, leading fMRI researchers, and said, okay, analyze these data, tell us what's going on. So this was an experiment by the fMRI researchers themselves, trying to see, are their methods for analyzing this stuff, are they accurate? Every group came back with a different answer.
Wow.
So when you see something in the paper or on a website saying this part of the brain lights up if you do X, Y, and Z, well, there's 2 things to think. Firstly, well, really? Does it? Are you sure about that? Has somebody replicated that? Has somebody else done that study? And then you might want to say, well, so what? What's that actually telling me? What does it tell me about how the brain works to say this bit of the brain is active? Is it doing more? Is it doing less? You've got bazillions of neurons in there. How are they interacting? Now, it can be useful. It may say, you know what, if you're operating on somebody and, I don't know, they've got a particular skill, you want to be very, very careful about taking that bit of the brain out because you could do them damage. But to be honest, we know that pretty much already. Now, there has been some useful important data from this. So I mentioned the face recognition stuff. Face recognition initially came from putting electrodes in monkeys' brains. So when I was a student, this paper came out, and they were almost embarrassed because this was the time of the grandmother cell, and everybody thought, well, however vision works, it doesn't work by having cells that do particular things. And they were poking around in the monkey's brain doing various things, and then they noted, allegedly, somebody waved their hand in front of the projector, because you're projecting the image onto a screen and you're recording for the poor old monkey. Allegedly, somebody waves their hand so you get a shadow, and this cell they're recording for goes crazy. Cut a long story short, they find cells that respond to a monkey's hand, and only to a monkey's hand. They much less to a human hand, to a silhouette. Yeah. And they say this at the end of the paper in kind of an embarrassed way, which I can imagine, because everybody thought this was nonsense. About 8 years later, some other researchers in the UK did the same thing with sheep. So they're recording from sheep brains, and they find that there are cells that respond to a sheep's face. And they can recognize different sheep, and they know a sheep from a dog and from a human. And they like the sheep, and they're not quite so impressed by the dog and the human as you might expect. And then, unlike monkeys, people have done this with monkeys, and they found monkey cells, and the monkey cells didn't care whether the monkey was upside down or not. Sheep, however, only really interested in sheep being the right way up. And as the researchers say, well, this is probably because they don't often see sheep upside down, whereas monkeys are always, you know. So people then went looking for similar kind of areas in the human brain using fMRI, and they found these parts, and in primates, which are very similar to us, and they found part of the brain which seems to be involved in detecting faces using the using fMRI, and that then led to these studies that I've talked about where they put electrodes in. So it has provided some great insight, and my guess is that in the end we'll find a way of putting people with problems, you know, who are in deep coma, putting them in a scanner and saying, are you in there or not? I mean, there are some people who claim they can do it. This is a big area of argument at the moment. I think in general people think you can't. But my guess is eventually the resolution of these scanners, and above all using deep learning, so computer programs to look for differences that we might find a hard time picking out, the computers may well be able to pick out the difference between somebody who is in there and somebody who isn't. But there's, as I say, it's a big argument it's not even an argument, people just don't talk about it. But when you've got, you know, as I say, I think now there's been a groundswell of change, and people in the fMRI community are recognizing there is an issue. And this most recent study of these 70 groups showing, look, we're all analyzing it in different ways and we've got different answers. That's very worrying. It suggests that there's a lot of noise in our data. Yeah.
So on the sort of cells, some cells responding to like certain stimuli, like the Jennifer Aniston one, for example, at some point that woman wouldn't have known like who Jennifer Aniston was. How does the brain change throughout life or over time? Is that, I guess we don't know.
Well, I've got a basic answer, which is more an article of faith, but I think it's true. And that is that neurons that fire together, this is a phrase that people say, neurons that fire together wire together. So synapses. So this is something that was first shown, it was first argued theoretically by a brilliant man called Donald Hebb, who in fact was linked with the work on doing the stimulation that made people hear music and stuff. So all these people are kind of connected. They're all, it's a bit incestuous. They're all the offspring of, you know, intellectual offspring. They did their PhD with different people. Anyway, Donald Hebb writes a book in 1949, which basically lays out, just by thinking about it, about how nervous systems work, the ideas we've got at the moment. And this basically says that if you've got two neurons that are firing a lot together, both firing, then that synapse, that passage from one neuron to another will tend to become strengthened and almost structural. You know, it'll kind of, it's not quite binding, but that's the idea. And you can see this in So you can imagine this very, very simple learning idea, which in fact people suggested back in the 18th century that maybe a memory, they argued, was the association, say, and they used this example actually long before Pavlov did, that a sound and a taste might become associated in your mind. So Pavlov rang a bell and the dog salivated, yeah, because he trained them that way. And so maybe if you got, they're close together, this was the argument, it's called associationist theory in the 18th century, that if you got the bit of your brain associated with detecting a sound and another bit of your brain associated with detecting a taste, and they're really, really close together, then you would end up associating with two, and the bell for dinner would ring, and you'd think, oh, dinner time, or the gong, I suppose they had in those days, because they were all posh people who lived in big houses who did this kind of stuff. So the gong would ring, and you would know, you start thinking, oh, food. And that's what they argued, all that an idea is. It's just these two things being stuck together. And basically that's the same idea. And you can show this in very simple nervous systems. You can show the strengthening of a synapse by simply doing it over and over again. Just think about it. Learning. How do you learn to ride a bike? You know, people say, oh, I've got muscle memory. I can still ride a bike even though I haven't ridden it for 10 years. But I don't know what muscle memory is. I don't think it is a thing, it's posture. But underlying that is synapses that have become strengthened to the point of you can't undo them. Can you forget how to ride a bike? Probably, maybe 70, 80 years, but probably not, actually. So some things you are never going to forget. You know, your mother's maiden name, that's not going to go. Yeah, it's there. And the strengthening of those connections, and I have no idea how your mother's maiden name is represented in your brain, but it's in there somewhere, thankfully, otherwise you wouldn't ever be able to have a password or get through a password check. But it's, you know that, and that's because the synapses have become completely intertwined. The neurons representing those things, no idea how that is, but in some way they are now completely kind of connected.
Is that a guess? Or
well, it's an educated guess. I mean, it's an application of what we know from simple organisms. So we know this happens. They don't have mothers' maiden names, but they can associate different things like touch. So this was all done on a big mollusk, like a big slug, a sea slug, which is about that big, a thing called a plesio. Neuroscientists have never seen one. They're about that. They're huge, whopping great big things. And basically, if you touch its gill, the gill will retract because it doesn't like being touched. If you touch it and then shock it, it really doesn't like being shocked, and so it will retract even more quickly. And then, if you just touch it again, it thinks it's going to be shocked, and it will withdraw as though it had been shocked. Yeah. So it's associated these two levels of stimuli: a terrible shock, not terrible, but not nice, with a gentle touch. And now it's been sensitized. It's called. So it's a very simple form of learning, and that they have been able to show the biochemical basis, and that is all those neurotransmitters I was talking about. That's what's involved there, and that's all been identified, and the genes involved, and these are the same genes involved in what got me interested in this whole area anyway when I was an undergraduate in working with flies. So they made a fly that couldn't learn. In fact, it could learn, it just couldn't remember for very long. It was a memory mutant, and the same gene is involved in this sea slug, as in the fly, and as in you remembering your mother's name. It's all the same. It's the same genes, it's the same stuff, and it's the same method. So it's an educated guess, but I can't tell you where in your brain your mother's name is. Nobody can, but it's going to be a distributed set of networks. And if we poked around with in all your 80 billion neurons, in the end, we'd stimulate them and you would blurt out your mother's name, and then we'd be able to raid your bank account.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Can we get into, I know you don't like philosophical questions, but can we go there?
Well,
can we ask you a few? Well,
I'm not a philosopher, that's not what I do.
Well, it's kind of, so what do we know about sleep, dreams? Do we know anything about them?
Yeah, there's virtually nothing about sleep in the book, actually. It's one of there's lots of things in the book that are missing. So there's virtually nothing about sense of smell, although I work on it.
Yeah.
Dreams, yeah, dreams, man. And we're all having weird dreams now. Well, I don't know about you, but I mean, it's got a bit better now, but certainly for the first 2 or 3 months.
Yeah.
Dreams, very strange. I was watching a video on Twitter the other day. Somebody had filmed a sleeping bee. So bees sleep, and these are solitary bees, so they haven't gone into the hive, and they sleep by just kind of putting their mandibles onto a stalk of grass or something. So they latch on so they can't fall off, and they just sit there overnight. And basically, we can, by studying the way what's happening in their brain, people have been a bit coy. They've said these are sleep they look like sleep, what their brains are doing. So they're going to get these rhythmic behaviors that we can see in insects and humans, that when you're asleep, you get these lovely rhythms, and the brain's doing this stuff. God knows what it means. And bees are doing that too. So we know bees sleep. And then this person's filming it, this bee, and then it starts moving its abdomen, which you may remember in a few weeks' time, you'll start seeing wasps about in particular, and they will move their abdomen like this, and they do it as a way, it's a bit like breathing, so that they can get oxygen into them, and it also looks kind of threatening. Sometimes you'll see the actual sting come out of the wasps at the end, and they do this, and you think, okay, I'm keeping back. So I don't know whether that bee was just cross with the person with filming it, woken up and was going, oh, I'm going to pretend I'm going to sting you. But maybe it was dreaming. I mean, we know pets dream, you know. You can, your dog will gallop, your cat will twitch, your cat will lap. One of the cats I used to have many years ago, it would lie there and start lapping asleep. And you can see its eyes moving. So we know when people are dreaming, they have rapid eye movement. REM, it's not just the name of a band. It's actually something that happens, rapid eye movement, flicking around. We know that because if you wake people up and they go, oh my God, my Auntie Jessie just turned into a lobster again. They know they're dreaming. You're having something odd happening. So mammals will dream. I mean, I don't know what that means, but they're dreaming. They're replaying. They're doing something in their heads whilst they're asleep. And I had this cat, and he'd be lapping. So I'd then get a teaspoon of cold tea in it, and you put it on the side, and of course he'd then start lapping because there's tea in his hand, and he'd carry on. Then eventually he'd wake up, and you could see him go, "Whoa, wait, what? But is that? But that's real. I can taste that stuff. That dream, that was real. I'm having it. What's dream and what's reality, man?" So the cat didn't know, and I don't know either. So we don't. Yeah, the very short answer is we have no idea about dreams. They're very weird. They're clearly. The fact that we've all been having more intense dreams shows, I mean, this is all banal. You know this. It's to do with anxiety. We all have the dream about standing in front of, for me, it's going into a lecture theatre and I don't know what I'll play. I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know the part I'm supposed to be playing. And generally, I've forgotten my trousers, We've all had those dreams.
Yeah.
No, just me. So we've all had, we have anxiety dreams, which might be trivial, might be absolutely terrifying. You wake up, you think you've killed somebody. I hate that. And it takes you a while to work out what's going on. Nobody knows what dreams are about. They're very important. If you don't do them, then bad things happen to you. And people who say they don't have dreams, what they mean is they don't remember them. My guess is that, certainly I'm very confident that all mammals are dreaming. They'll have dreams. My guess is I don't see any reason why insects shouldn't do. I mean, whatever they're doing, it's significant for brain function. What will they have to sleep? No idea, but you've got to do it.
Yeah.
You need it. I mean, I'm just telling you like it is, man. We don't know anything.
It is very refreshing, right? Honestly, because I see people, they tell you, oh, what is the nature of consciousness, or we don't know anything. That I think we should appreciate our ignorance. At least we won't have to worry about getting AI eliminated, right?
Well, no, I mean, I'm not worried about AI at all.
Yeah. Again, we have people public figures Elon Musk. He's what? No, okay, no, don't worry about it, guys.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big argument about this, and I mean, it is. I think we should take. I think we should take AI very seriously, but not because it's going to become like us. It's going to be like it becomes Skynet in the Terminator things, and then decide to kill everybody.
Yeah.
I'm more concerned about it not becoming conscious and deciding to kill everybody. So there's that fantastic video. What's it called? Killer bots, the Killbots. So if you watch this, it's a brilliant video made by a campaigning organization that's worried about autonomous robots. So autonomous machines, autonomous killing robots, which the military want, of course. So we've already got drones, which is great because nobody dies except the people who are bombed with them. So, you know, our boys can sit at home. In fact, it's some guy who's spent his life playing computer games. Sorry if that's you, lads. I've never gone beyond Tetris, so I'm not part of that. But, you know, these are people who are killing people via a screen. Let's cut out that guy. We don't need him. Why do we need him? We can program it to do ourselves. And that is when it gets scary. And we can't do that yet, but there's a very good video shot like initially it looks like a kind of Steve Jobs, Apple, you know, product presentation of these killbots, that tiny little robots that can take out the bad guys because we've got face recognition, and that works great. And we all know who the bad guys are. So you can see people, you know, in the Pentagon and in the Ministry of Defense getting very excited about this. And the video then shows what can happen. So go on YouTube, put in, I think it's Killbots. If you can't find that, then look for autonomous killer robots and you'll find it eventually. And it is absolutely terrifying. So I'm worried about robots, but not because they'll know what they're doing, but because they're going to do what we've told them to do. And the people who work in AI generally suck. You've all seen those videos of, you know, even a receptor, a detector that's supposed to say you got your hands under the tap. You know, the black guy puts his hand under it, it can't see it, you know. The white guy puts, oh, it works. Black guy, no. So, you know, the AI is going to be stupid. Yeah. That having been said, it is unbelievably stupid. So one thing that isn't in the book, but which I do show to people to show them what AI is like. So there's a fantastic book. I'm sorry, just get my presentation. Here we go. There's a fantastic book by a researcher called Janelle Shane. It's called You're a Thing and I Love You. And she works in AI. And she uses, there's a neural net that can write. So students, you'll love this. You give it lots of text and it then splurges it back, but in the most amazing way. And it can write reasonable sentences. There's a new version of it just come out, and it's written a philosophy paper, which is kind of like first year bad undergraduate philosophy paper. It's a bit ropey, but it's not bad. Anyway, she gave it some love hearts, you know, the little sweets that have got be mine and all that. You know, those ones that are really, you know what love hearts are? No? Yeah?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So she gave them this and gave this computer this and said, right, make me some love hearts. I'm just going to read some of them out to you. What this computer, the be all, you know, the top level, the best we've got, what it thinks a love heart would be. We got mouthy hamster, biohazard, the end, so be it. That could be it. And then fart booby, yes, 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 balls, kitten band, doomed, and ants can stay. The computer's got no idea. It knows it needs a short phrase, but it doesn't understand what you have to have on a love heart. And that's the issue with AI, is that it doesn't understand. Even if it can imitate us, it can look, you know, it can write a first year undergraduate level essay. That's pretty scary, but it has no idea what it's doing. And furthermore, we don't understand how they work. Not me. I don't understand anything. I certainly don't understand AI. But the people who work on them. So Jeffrey Hinton, he's the big Google guy who's working on all these deep mind things that do amazing things. This astonishing paper they did in 2012, something like that. And they gave this neural network about 10 million YouTube stills to look at. So they're just sending it through. Now, computer can't see the image. What it's seeing is just zeros and ones. It's just looking for patterns. And they say to the computer, okay, what patterns can you see in there? And it goes around and it just digests these 10 million stills. And then in the end, it says, I think I can recognize a cat. So it's been looking at YouTube videos, right? So it can see a cat, because that's mainly what there is on YouTube videos. And what it can recognize is basically a set of ears, kind of head shape, little mouth thing, which is absolutely remarkable. If you gave it a new set of pictures of cats that it had never seen, it didn't do very well. So it was only really good at picking out the consistency in the YouTube videos that or the zeros and ones it had been looking at. And so this remarkable activity, Geoffrey Hinton was asked, had this interview last year, and they said, there's this problem, which is we don't entirely know how these things work, right? And Hinton says, quite cheery, he says, no, we really don't know how they work. So he's building these programs, setting them to run on and saying, hey, see what you can see in these 10 million YouTube videos. And he's no idea how it's actually doing what it's doing. So I'm not worried about AI. I don't think it's going to pop up, because I think that brains are much more interesting than computers and much more complicated. But I am worried about robots getting out of control and people not realizing the implicit bias there is in AI and quite how stupid AI is, and therefore, handing over our jobs and everything to it.
And just to end the interview on, what is your biggest fear for the future, near future? Is it the same as the AI?
What, about the brain or about the world?
Well, he asks everyone this.
Yeah, we're all worried.
Well, let's leave outside pandemics. I mean, that used to be a joke you could tell a couple of years ago, because we all knew it was coming. I mean, seriously, you'd say, well, okay, assuming I think I said it can't remember, I said it in some book I wrote somewhere that, apart from the spillover pandemic, which will inevitably get us, and climate change, of course, because when the pandemic's gone, which it will do, it'll kill a lot of people, but it will go. Then we got climate change. What else is there to worry about? Come on, that's enough. Yeah. My generation have trashed the place. You lot have got to fix it. Sorry. Normally it's the kids who trash the parents' home. This time it's the other way around. We've trashed your home. I'm very sorry for that. But we had fun,
Well, that's what we're trying to achieve in this podcast, trying to bring on some people from your generation to help us.
to make us take the blame. Well, I'll take the blame. I mean, not me personally, but my generation's failure to destroy capitalism in May '68. Okay, there you go. I'll give you that. We hadn't got, we had a chance of changing a global system and we failed, and the world went on and got worse and worse. So mea culpa, nostra culpa, or whatever it is. Okay. I'm very sorry for that. No, in terms of what the future holds for the brain, if that's the question you're asking, and we did say there's a little bit at the end of the book, I really don't know. My guess is that, as I said earlier on, they've got all these data coming out from different, there are tens of thousands of researchers all over the world, maybe 100,000 researchers producing loads and loads of papers. There's a vast amount of effort going into trying to understand the brain from all different sorts of points of view, from, people working with computers, making connectomes, trying to work out how it's all wired together, people interested in the chemistry, everything. But there's this generalized feeling that we don't know how to fit it all together. We don't know how to make the data make sense. We don't have a model that everybody can agree on. And we've seen that in the kind of different examples I've been talking about. You can see the complexity of it and the fact that, well, how do we fit the chemistry with the computer? It doesn't really make much kind of sense. So the simple thing to say would be, right, well, because we can see this link between the best technology of the time and how we see the brain. We can see it in Descartes' statues. We can see it in the telegraph system in the early 19th century and the late 19th century in the telephone exchange. And these are all things that people said, oh, the brain is like telephone exchange, for example. Or a computer, which is basically where we've been since the 1950s. The brain is like a computer. When we get some new spiffy technology, and I'm not talking Bitcoin, whatever that is, and we're talking actual technology that does stuff, not just a scam that makes money. When we get new technology, that which is different from the computer, that will give us a new way of looking at the brain. The problem with that is, I mean, when you talk to neuroscientists about this, they get very excited because they realize that a lot of the way they think is in this metaphorical way without even realize, you know, it's not something that you kind of worry about unless you read a book like mine, or you're like me and you're thinking about it. In general, they just get on with it and they say, well, the brain's carrying out computations. Let's try and work out what those computations are. They don't question where that comes from and what might be the limits of that idea. And the problem is that they get very excited. They say, okay, right, so if technology is determining our metaphors and we've got a bit of a hard problem at the moment of working out where we're going, so what's the next technology? To which the answer is, well, if I knew that, I'd be very rich. I'd be retired on my island. I wouldn't care about anything. You know, I'd be COVID-free and very happy. I've no idea what's coming next. You know, that's way out of my pay grade. And the last paragraph of the book is one big, long paragraph. It's a very long paragraph. Well, initially it was one sentence, and then we broke it up and put full stops in it where there used to be semicolons, basically saying all the different things that could happen in the future. I don't know, but we are beginning to get at an impasse. Scientists are trying to work out where we got to go next. We need new ideas, and some of that is going to come by thinking about it consciously. Some of that's going to percolate in from culture. But part of the starting point is the scientists daring to tell the general public what we all tell each other in late night sessions in conferences, which is now all on Zoom, that, hey, we've no idea, have we? And I go, no, we really don't understand it. So my book is partly just pulling the curtain back and saying, look, this is what they say behind your backs. They haven't the foggiest. Don't pay them any attention. And what is going to happen in the future, I don't know. But if there is a new technology that emerges, then that will change how we think about the brain. That's obvious because it's happened at every stage. If there isn't, then I suspect there'll be kind of incremental improvements. My own taste, because I work on small brains, or not even on brains, but small things that you can manipulate very easily, would be to emphasize trying to understand not human consciousness, because I think we're centuries away from that, if ever. I mean, fine if people want to study it, but I think we'll get breakthroughs by modeling those simple systems like the maggot's nose and its brain, like the lobster's stomach, the fly's brain. If we can work out how a maggot works and model it in a computer, in 50 years' time, I think we'll be doing brilliantly. And that's not even a fly, that's a maggot. Maggot's got about 12,000 neurons rather than 100,000. Maggot's a bit thick, which is why I study it. But it can learn, and it can wriggle, and it can do all sorts of things, and we're beginning to get there in terms of understanding how its brain's put together and being able to manipulate those cells. But we can't yet predict what will happen if we take one cell out. We're back with the lobster's stomach problem. There is emergent properties that come out of networks that we don't have any theoretical understanding of at the moment.
Well, I guess one less thing to worry about. No one will be able to read your brain, well, probably even in our lifetime. So I don't think we're there. I don't think we're there yet. But if we could end up with being able to tell if people are in a deep coma, we're in there. So, in other words, can you safely, if somebody really brain dead, can we safely turn this off ethically? Is there any hope of them coming back? Because clearly if they're in there, you don't want to do anything bad. You want to do nice things to them. If we can find that, that would be fantastic. Maybe that could come, but at the moment it's not clear. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was a fascinating interview.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Nathan. Been
really
good talking to you.
Yeah, hope we can have you back on in the future.
Well, yeah, if we're all still around.
Yes. Fingers
Stay
crossed.
safe, everybody. Keep away from, keep your social distance, wear your mask in the shop, and depending on when you're watching this, whatever future advice is being given, because it will change.
Yeah. Follow the NHS guidelines.
Absolutely. NHS, scientists, not necessarily the government will be.
Yeah. We'll end on that note. Don't trust the government.
No.
Okay.
Right. Good to speak to you, lads.
Yeah.
Have a great evening.
And you too. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So it was our interview with the brilliant Matthew Cobb, the author of The Idea of the Brain. Links in the description. We'll put it down there. Please make sure to consider buying the book. It's a very good book. I've read parts of it. It's brilliant. So tell me, Nathan, what did you think of the interview?
It gave me the abiding impression that we don't know. That's the thing that I got out of the interview. We don't know a hell of a lot. I guess is comforting, intriguing. It's definitely nice to know that we're not going to be taken over by AI.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Honestly, I hate we have a lot of problems, right? We have a lot of problems to worry about, right? We've covered global warming. We got big data. That's a problem. We got hacking. We got spying. Like they're proper. Like Google and Facebook are literally they'll be able to predict your thoughts in a few years.
Well,
they will. Trust me, they will. Yeah. If they can do, yeah. If they probably can already. Honestly, literally, right? Whenever I think of anything, I'll Google it. I bet you Google has an algorithm that can predict what my next thought will be.
You know, there's a thing about Cambridge, Netflix thing about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook claiming they had, I can't remember if it was 5,000 data points on each person. Of course, you can get some level of control if you've got that much information. Anyway, that's a tangent.
Yeah. So there are serious issues that are real. They're not sci-fi. They're actually, but unfortunately, I think because some prominent people are talking about it, Elon Musk, and we got a lot of like films made about them. People are making it a much bigger deal than it currently is. We're not accidentally gonna hit some super consciousness being that can overtake us overnight. That's not gonna happen. It's more likely some dodgy human with good computers doing some dodgy things to you.
Yeah, I found it quite interesting as well what you said about sort of the brain being an integrated system with the body and like the gut biome affecting sort of emotions and the way people are thinking. That was quite interesting. Like how if what you eat is affecting how you think, is it ties in quite well to the idea.
I mean, like
superfoods, stuff like that.
What it came down to. Yeah, he said like we don't understand how. He said we don't understand how the brain works, how the neurons work, right? And neurons are essentially nerves. They're nerve cells. Nerve cells are called neurons. And you got nerves all over your body. And if we don't know how they work, it is entirely possible that your consciousness includes your whole body. It's not exclusive to your brain.
I mean, this is getting towards philosophy because you're still you if you lose your leg, aren't you?
Yeah, probably yes. But for example, we don't know if you do a head transplant, will you still be you? Well, we don't know if we actually don't know if your consciousness will be the same if you do a head transplant.
Oh, I think that type of surgery is quite a long way away.
Maybe there are people working on it though. There are people.
You can't have my head, Mohammed. Hands off.
Oh, have you seen Face Off?
No.
It's very they don't swap heads, but they swap faces. It's very stupid because and then that guy goes with that guy's wife. That he goes with it's a mess. Yeah. Yes, and then they try to kill each other. Then I don't get it.
Is this a film or a really strange dream?
With Nicolas Cage in it.
Okay.
Yeah. Uh, anyway, another thing I learned that was very interesting was about how about the what is it called, the brain scanners. What are they called?
So the fMR.
Yeah, the fMRI scanners.
Yeah.
They don't show you much. They're like a very fuzzy picture from a mile away, and like maybe like that. Like it's mad. Like their resolution is extremely low. If a picture's resolution was like that bad, you'll have the foggiest idea. Yeah. So we don't. And lobsters have 30 neurons in their belly, and and someone has been working on it for 20 years, and it still doesn't know how the lobsters
The
belly
patience.
works.
I would have given up by that point.
Honestly, yeah. They can't model it. It's weird. Yeah. Like I would have thought they would be able to get it. 30 neurons. But yeah, so that they are very complicated things. They're not digital. Your computer won't gain consciousness. Relax. What else?
I guess it's a bit like I can't remember who said it. I meant all the exact quote. I can barely remember what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But I meant to look it up. From a guy called Ian Stewart, who wrote a book called The Collapse of Chaos, Discovering Simplicity in a Complex World. I've got no idea what that's about. But he said, if our brains were simple enough for us to understand them, we'd be so simple that we couldn't.
Say it again.
If our brains were simple enough for us to understand them, we'd be so simple that we couldn't. So
Ooh, that's so deep. That's so deep. I love it.
The idea that, like, if we were...
Yeah.
No.
The very fact that the very fact that our brains are so complicated prevents us from understanding our brains.
Yeah. So, I guess it's kind of a question of whether it's something that's a knowable unknown or an unknowable unknown.
Is it a knowable unknown or an unknowable unknown?
I'm hopeful the neuroscientists out there that it's a knowable unknown, so they can have very long careers.
Yes. I think they're over promising it though. We won't get it for a while. It will be a while. I guess at the end of the day it has to be some semblance of information in our head. It's not to do with the cells themselves, because the cells die off. So it has to be some pattern, some whatever it is between the neurons. They're keeping some patterns that remain what's you, or is it? Or is it maybe you're an ever-changing thing?
Would not want to take a guess. Engineer, give me a off-camp any day. Logic gates. It was quite interesting hearing about, like, that they can't tell any structural difference between people experiencing sort of mental health problems or sort of people who are capable of doing some things and of people who aren't capable of doing the same thing, and there's no like visible structural difference in the brain or brain activity. That was something that was really interesting.
And another interesting was about the sort of mental illnesses being a chemical problem. And he was saying that basically, well, so if it's a chemical problem, right? So as soon as you take in the medicine, your chemicals change. But it doesn't fix the problem. For those whom it works, it takes at least a few weeks. For example, if you're depressed, you take antidepressant. I don't know what it's called, the antidepressant drug.
Well, loads of different ones.
Yeah. So if it was a chemical issue, right? You take it, your chemical imbalances are balanced now. You should come out of depression. But first of all, it doesn't even work on everyone. It doesn't work on it. It works on some people, not everyone. And those it works on takes weeks. So what the hell is going on there?
Yeah, and like I guess like various mental health problems that aren't like always present. So, for example, PTSD or something like that. Like is that? I found it really interesting that they can't tell the difference structurally between what's going on with somebody who could be experiencing a full-blown panic attack or something like that, or somebody who's living a sort of completely mentally healthily, and it kind of draws into question all of our sort of conclusions about intelligence and what's sort of a brain functioning properly, or what's
I had a few assumptions, but after he had to go at all the like he literally questioned the whole field of what did you say, fMRI?
Yeah, I think that's what it's called.
Check it.
Yeah, fMRI, functional magnetic resonant imaging.
It used to be nuclear magnetic resonance, but they removed the nuclear because people wouldn't have wanted to go in it.
Oh, yeah, for heaven's sake.
If it was nuclear magnetic resonance, I'm not going in. Yeah, so he literally questioned the whole...
I think fMRI is a special type of MRI.
Yeah, it's the brain one.
Yeah.
Like MRI could be your whole body.
Yeah, I think it works maybe slightly differently.
fMRI is just the one you just put your head in.
Yeah.
See if you have a tumor or something.
Yeah, what were you saying?
Yeah, he questioned all the studies. He said it was around 80,000 studies that their device wasn't calibrated properly. So yeah, and I've seen a lot of like TED Talk videos, people saying, "Oh, look, when we show you that picture, that area is working." I was like, okay, so we have a pretty good idea of how the brain works, right? That area lights up. So first of all, it shows us very terrible resolution. Second of all, it could have been that there was some proper flaw in their whole methodology.
Well, I guess TED Talks aren't peer reviewed.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, people will applaud, but they're not peers. They're just public. They're public reviewed. Yeah, and we know public doesn't. Public doesn't have any irrational beliefs, right?
Right.
Anyway, we don't know why we sleep. We don't know why we dream. It's just we don't know it. There is some comfort in that. I take comfort in our ignorance. I do.
Yeah.
Because just watch. If you don't get what I'm talking about, just watch some Black Mirror. You'll get it. You'll get it. Black Mirror on Netflix. Go watch it. You'll get all my... Yeah, so they're all bollocks. Yeah. And as far as as far as we can tell, I'm not any dumber than Einstein, because you can't tell.
No, I'm not sure that's quite what he said.
You can't tell. You can't tell.
Okay,
From looking at our brains.
That's the conclusion that Mohammed's drawn.
Yeah, I'm no less intelligent than Einstein. I'm going for it. You can't tell. You can't tell.
Until he opens his mouth.
Or takes an IQ test. Anyway.
Do you want to leave it?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we'll end it here, I guess. It's around 1 a.m. here. Yeah, everything's getting dark.
Oh, getting dark.
Well, yeah, it's all darkness. It's all darkness, just like the study of brain. All darkness and ignorance. Words aren't even float. Okay, I'm gonna show up your heart symbol.
Oh.
Okay. Bye-bye. Right. Cool.